Hello and welcome back. Let's see, how do I say this? It is my deepest and most sincere regret to inform you that our intended guest for the day, Captain Jack Sparrow, there was an unexpected delay on his ship, and he's not going to be able to make it today. So instead, we have another guest. Hi, I'm Henry. Great to be here with you guys today. Your loss, my gain, I guess. Yeah, our loss. So, Henry, why don't you go ahead and tell us about yourself? Well, I work as a package designer. A package designer? Yeah. So like if you get a package in the mail, and it's boxed all nice and things fit in place and stuff, that was designed by a package designer. Oh, like an Apple product. I wish. Those guys are up there, man. Up there. So who do you work for? Hallmark. The gift card company? Yeah. But I know. You probably think, hey, it's one fold, you know, why do you need a package designer? But, you know, hamburger or hot dog, that's all I gotta say, right? There's a lot of thought that goes into that. I'm sure there is. Well, moving on. Today we're talking about quasi-experiments. Here are our goals and objectives for today. Understand experimental settings and internal validity versus external validity, etc., 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 etc. Yeah, we'll return to these later. So, internal validity. Working example. Suppose we want to determine how much mindfulness reduces stress. Experimenter then shocks participants, EGATs, and instructs them to be mindful. And then there are two conditions. In the mindful condition, participants are informed that they need to be present and accepting of the experimental conditions. Whereas in the control, participants aren't given any instructions whatsoever. They just get a shock. Hallelujah. So, internal validity, what is it? I know you know. Yep. The degree to which our causal conclusions are accurate. And so we conclude the treatment caused the difference between the, we want to conclude the treatment caused the difference between the groups, but was it the treatment or might it have been something else? And so what are these threats to internal validity? So ask yourself, what causal statements are we trying to make? What other causes could be responsible for the independent variable, dependent variable relationship? And what causal statements are we going to be making about mindfulness here? So we are hopefully going to conclude that mindfulness allows one to better deal with the pain of being shocked without getting all upset and stuff. Now let's add some terminology. Here are a bunch of threats to internal validity. And to help us out with each of these, Hank here. Hank, was that your name? Henry. Oh, yeah, he's Henry. So Henry here is going to give us an example of each of these. So history, so something that happens outside the lab is responsible for change. So Henry, you care to give us an example? Yeah, so let's say you're designing a card and you want to know if this new card is awesome. And so you plan to launch it in January, or no, let's say, okay, let me think of another example here. Oh, I got one. Let's say that you start designing like serious, sympathetic, heartfelt cards, and then later you decide you want to change it to more funny cards, and so you start measuring how much sales there were before you did the funny cards, and then after you did the funny cards, and then you see that there's a dramatic decrease, and little do you know that during that time, so little do you know that during that time was when e-cards became popular. Do you need a minute? No, I got this. So e-cards become popular, and so you see this dip and you think it might be because people don't like funny cards, but in reality it's because something happened outside the lab. That's history. Very good. So the next one is maturation, where we have changes in scores are due to the fact that changes occur naturally over time, not because of the intervention. So I'm going to take this one. So an example is, let's say that, so maturation, an example might be that you measure people's blood pressure before coming into the lab, teach them to be mindful, and then measure after the mindfulness training, and then you see a drop in blood pressure, and you want to conclude that it was a mindfulness, but in reality it's probably just maturation, that they are habituating to the circumstances. Testing. We have changes in scores are due to the increased familiarity with the test, not because of the intervention. So if somebody takes a test twice, second time they're probably going to be better, but that's just because they are more familiar with the test, not because they actually, the intervention, whatever it might be, worked. Instrumentation, so changes in scores reflect changes in instruments used to measure things, not the intervention. So, for example, a test may become more unreliable over time, or maybe at time 1 you had some inter-rater measure of some sort, and then time 2 there were different measures, and so the changes might be due to the different measures. Oh, and why I don't suck now as a woodworker. Okay, so here's the thing. For like 10 years, I was using my beautiful SawStop table saw. Very expensive saw, and love it. And for like 10 years, okay, why I don't suck more now as a woodworker. So, used to be 5 years ago that I would make a project and things would line up. I'd be able to assemble a table or a bed or something, and everything worked out. And then over the last 5 years, I've progressively gotten suckier, so that when it comes to assembly time, I put things together and things aren't square, things aren't lining up. And I thought, what the heck? I should be getting better here, not getting worse. Well, it turns out that what happened was gradually over time. So on one side of the table saw is the fence, on one side is the blade, and I assumed that they were 100% parallel to one another. But what happened was over time, they became less and less parallel to one another. And as I was making cuts, I would end up having tapered wood pieces that wouldn't work very well. And so the change here wasn't because I sucked as a woodworker and getting worse, it was because my instrument itself was progressively failing. So that sort of thing might happen with a blood pressure cuff or something like that. Regression. So sometimes you want to study extreme groups, like those who are really high in depression and those who are really low in depression, and then make some sort of comparison. And then what tends to happen is that people who are in the extremes, over time, they just get better. So an example of this might be, let's say you've got a bunch of people that came into therapy, and generally you only go to therapy when things get really bad. And so you measure people in their depression, for example, before therapy and then after therapy, and lo and behold, everybody improves. Wahoo, therapy works. Well, maybe it's actually not the therapy. Maybe they're just regressing back to the mean. They were extreme, and then just random fluctuations, they eventually get better. Next is attrition. That's when people drop out of a study. We've talked about this example. So you have an exercise group and a non-exercise group, and you want to assess the benefits of exercise on some outcome variable. Well, it turns out it's really hard to exercise. And so you get differential dropouts. So you get some people in the more people in the exercise group dropping out than people in the control group. And so the observed difference that you are seeing is not due to exercise alone. It's due to the fact that there was exercise and it was just harder in the exercise group. Selection is when the observed differences are due to characteristics of the groups themselves, not the treatment. So we've talked about this one. You got vegans versus meat eaters, and you observe that there is a lower rate of cholesterol or blood pressure or whatever, or heart disease in the vegan group, and you want to conclude that it's the fact that they are not eating red meat. Well, actually, there's a lot of self-selection going on there, lots of characteristics that make vegans different from non-vegans. And then here are three that we haven't talked about for a while. One is contamination, and that happens when the treatment is diffused through participants to the control group. So let's say you've got one location at a lab where people are experiencing the treatment. And oh, actually, I've got a good example of this. So when I was an undergraduate, I did an experiment looking at the role of empathy in peer evaluation inflation. And I went into a classroom, and within the same class, there were both treatment and control conditions. So the control condition was, hey, you're just giving people feedback for their own improvement, whereas the treatment condition was whatever evaluation you give your group member will affect their grade. And so, and I was hypothesizing that those who are more empathetic will inflate their ratings relative to those who aren't empathetic. Anyway, problem was, in one of the experimental conditions, or in one of the classrooms, everybody has their own, again, both treatment and control, and it's shown in a vignette. They either have the phrase, your rating will partially determine their grade versus not. And right in the middle of the experiment, somebody raised their hand and said, excuse me, how much is it going to influence their grade? And then I was like, uh-oh. And I thought I might be able to kind of diffuse the situation. And then one of the TAs stood up and they said, you got to understand, this is very important. And then she went on a 10-minute spiel about why it was important that everybody's evaluations affected everybody's grade. And of course, the treatment was then diffused across both groups. I had to throw that data out. So something like that, where the treatment and the control conditions are somehow talking to each other, or word gets out that this is what the treatment group gets and I'm in the control group. And then what can happen is that the effect of the treatment is diffused across the two groups. So you see no difference between the two, when in reality there would have been a difference if they hadn't just talked to each other. And then experimenter expectancies, that's when the experimenter expectations are responsible for the changes in scores. No explanation needed, am I right? And then novelty effects. So this would be when you observe a difference between treatment and control group, but it's not due to the treatment group per se. It's due to the it's not due to the treatment. It's due to the novelty of the treatment. So if you have something that's kind of, maybe you've got two modes of passing on a lecture. One is somebody's giving a traditional lecture, and then one is a YouTube video. Oh, and you want to assess how much people retain the information. And then the fact that this is novel, getting your lectures from YouTube, maybe that'll inflate the ratings or something like that. Or maybe it'll make it worse. So how do you control for these threats? Well, a comparison group allows you to handle these threats to validity, assuming that the treatment and control groups are measured simultaneously. It controls for history, maturation, instrumentation, and testing. And a random assignment allows you to handle these threats, this threat, selection, and then double blind plus a good placebo will help you address the experimenter expectancies and novelties. So threats to a randomized experiment. All right, let me pause for a minute. I know we're talking a lot about experiments. This is the quasi-experiment week. What the heck? Well, it's easiest to understand quasi-experiment when you contrast it with experiment, and no harm in reviewing this stuff. Am I right? Okay, so if you do randomization and a control group and a double blind and a placebo, these will control most threats to validity. But some still remain, such as attrition and contamination. So how do we address attrition? Well, we can use some missing data strategies. If y'all look at my multivariate videos, under the missing data one, you'll understand how that's done. And another way is to have a very good control group. So we might have something as cognitively challenging as mindfulness, for example. Or we might have something as rigorous as physical exercise in the control group. Anyway, we're just trying to make the reason to drop out equal across the two groups. Make sense? Another one is we can modify So now let's go ahead and modify our original experiment where we are shocking people and measuring mindfulness. So let's go ahead and randomize participants to treatment or control conditions. So in the treatment condition, during the stressful situation, we have them focus on nothing but the experience and accept it. So that's the mindfulness condition. And then the control, to make it a little more congruent with the treatment, during the stressful situation, they're getting shocked. We want them to focus on a happy thought. Okay, so that would be a much better control than just doing nothing. So the experimenter doesn't know what instructions they've received. So if we do that, we got a double-blind procedure. And the experimenter administers shocks to participants and measures the heart rate. So that's the same as before. So how do we address the contamination issue? Well, that's a little harder. Maybe duct tape participants' mouths as they leave. Or just tell them not to talk to other people. So, characteristics of randomized experiment. Henry, you want to handle this one? Absolutely! Okay, so these are the characteristics of randomized experiments. You know, we've got an intervention that is implemented, and then there's a high degree of control, and then there's a proper comparison treated exactly the same except for the treatment. And so they tend to be high in what? Validity? But low in what validity? Internal and external. Excellent, excellent. Okay, and still, but even with a randomized experiment and a control and a double blind and a placebo and a good control, we've handled all the threats. We've handled all the threats to internal validity, I think, mostly at least. And so now we are much safer in concluding that mindfulness affects stress, right? Well, yeah, absolutely. But now we've got another different problem. Now we're low in external validity. That's really a problem. And so our control, all these efforts to control things has really cost us generalizability, and that's just a new problem. And so the solution to threats to external validity is, of course, replication. So in this situation, we replicate both using the same conditions, because that's important, but also across different conditions. And so often this means we replicate in a more natural experiment. And I suspect that this is the reason why I was graciously invited to be on the show, is because at Hallmark, all the time we do quasi-experiments, because you got people in San Francisco and people in San Antonio and any other kind of San you can think of. San Diego. Anyway, so you got all sorts of different cities, and you can't randomly assign people to different cities, and so you might have a funny card in San Diego and then a not funny card in San Antonio. And then hopefully from these we can really kind of dial in things. So that's where the quasi-experiments come from. So there's really two definitions. There's a textbook definition where we have two pre-existing groups who were not randomly assigned. So that would be the textbook definition, like the one that I talked about with the different sands. I love that joke. That's a good one. And then a loose definition is that we've got some sort of intervention and a comparison. So we might have comparison across groups or across time, so before and after. So that's kind of more of a loose definition. I believe that's what your textbook writes, is a definition of quasi-experiments. So the strengths of these quasi-experiments is they tend to be done in naturalistic settings and thus have a much higher degree of external validity. The weaknesses is we now have to deal with threats to internal validity. So it's really a trade-off. And so we've got different design types, and okay, remember it's my show here, so if you don't mind just stepping aside. Okay. Yeah, so we got 4 different design types. We've got a one-group pre-test, post-test. We got non-equivalent control group design. We got an interrupted time series design, and we've got a time series with non-equivalent groups design. Oh boy, that's a funny comic. You get it? Because they think the magnet is, and it was just the whacking, and that's really funny. Boy, you're clever. Not my comic. I stole it off the internet. Oh yeah, I hate the internet. Yeah, clearly. So one group, pre-test, post-test design. So what happens here is that we've got one group, all people receive the intervention, and then we measure before and after the intervention. So here are some examples. Response to shock before and after mindfulness therapy, but there's no control group. We got satisfaction before and after eating organic for a week. We got scores before and after doing a GRE prep course. And then we've got depression before and after therapy. But all these examples suffer from the following problems: history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, and regression. So this is pretty much a useless design. It really doesn't tell you anything because you can't identify what the source of the change is. Could be history, could be maturation, blah, blah, blah. So that brings us to the non-equivalent control group design. So we have two groups that's self-selected. We randomly decide which group receives the intervention, and then we measure the outcome in both groups. And that's what Henry was talking about, that people have self-selected into San Diego and San Antonio, and we randomly decide which of those receives the intervention. Some other examples: response to shock for a mindfulness group versus an NRA group. I'm not sure why you would compare those groups, but whatever. Two health classes. One is told to eat organic, the other is told to not eat organic. Scores before and after a GRE prep course for sophomores versus juniors. And then depression before and after CBT versus self-help for two different therapists' clients. So let me just comment on one thing because this is a source of confusion. So with quasi-experiments or the non-equivalent control group design, usually the groups themselves aren't of interest. We don't really care about the two different health classes. We don't care about sophomores versus seniors. We don't care about the comparison between therapist A and therapist B or whatever. What we care about is the intervention, and we just happen to have these naturally occurring groups. And likewise, in Henry's example, we don't care about San Antonio and San Francisco. No offense to those watching from San Antonio or San Francisco. We just don't care about you. And we don't care about those from Glassboro. Technically Mollica Hill, but anyway, you get the idea. We don't care about those people. We just want to have some sort of comparison. So again, the groups themselves are not, the characteristics of the group or the things that make the groups distinct are not themselves of interest. What is of interest is the randomization of the intervention, that's the word. And so these will address history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, and regression, but problems still remain. We've still got selection, and we've got selection plus all of the above threats. So that's when selection interacts with one of these other threats. So sometimes threats can combine. So for example, you might have selection paired with maturation, where pre-existing characteristics of the group, selection, cause one to mature at a different rate than the other. Or you might have selection plus history. So one group has a different local history than another. So for example, if you're trying to look at the intervention of some sort of emergency preparedness procedure in Oklahoma versus New Jersey, having lived in Oklahoma, we saw a lot of natural disasters, lots of tornadoes. New Jersey, not as much. And so the pre-existing conditions of Oklahoma versus New Jersey might cause them to react differently based on their own personal history, if that makes sense. So Oklahoma having a lot of experience with natural disasters, they're going to respond differently to New Jersey. Make sense? Testing, one group learns to adapt to the test better than another. So you might have a morning class and an evening class, and maybe for some reason the evening class is smarter than the morning class for some reason. And so you measure them pre and post experiment, and the smarter people learn quicker. That's the basic idea. And then instrumentation. So the instrument of measurement differs between the groups. So that would be kind of a unique situation where you've got two groups and one's instrumentation is different than another's instrumentation. That's basically the idea. So in one, you might have clinical observation, and another one, it will be observed by another therapist. All right, an interrupted time series. Do you mind if I take this one? I guess. Can you just tone down the enthusiasm a little bit? Same goes for you, happy boy! All right, so interrupted time series, very similar to one group pre-test and post-test design, but we take multiple measurements before and after the intervention. So for example, we might have blood pressure compared before and after running a marathon, but you're gonna be doing it multiple times, okay? So you might measure them 10 times before they run a marathon and then 10 times or 5 times or 4 times afterwards. And then you might have a cholesterol before and after a 7-day organic eating event. Again, you're taking multiple measures. And then you might do 7 practice exams before and after a GRE prep score or depression scores before. Multiple times, again, measured and after therapy. And in all cases, you're going to be measuring lots and lots of times. And so the idea is that the chance that these scores will change right after the intervention dramatically is much smaller now because you have lots of multiple time points. So you can identify kind of the sequence of the trend before and then see if that trend changes after the intervention. So this gives better evidence. Oh dear, I think I saw the light go off in the camera. Should I do something? Actually, it wouldn't be a bad thing if you were not recorded. Boy, that's funny. Get this guy. Okay, so back to interrupted time series. So we now have better evidence that these are not playing a role: history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, and regression. But there's still a chance these confounds could just happen to take place at the time of the intervention. And so that gives us, that's a good segue into the time series with non-equivalent control group designs. And so this is like an interrupted time series, but we have a comparison group. And that group does not receive the intervention. So for example, we might have cholesterol before and after eating organic for a week versus another group that does not change their dietary habits. And so this gives us much better strength to suggest that history, maturation, and all those things are not playing a role, but selection may still play a role because, again, these are non-equivalent groups here. Oh wow! Look at that. We made it through fast. Boy, I'm surprised. That was just fun. So much fun, and I'm just so glad I could be here and share with you some of my insights and some of my expertise in this area. Well, I am glad you have had the pleasure of talking. Thank you for joining us today. That concludes our episode, I guess. Special thanks to Henry for participating, and we'll see you next time.